Today I want to talk to you a little bit about advocacy in writing. Advocacy is when you write with the goal of persuading someone of a position. It could be an opinion about which Star Trek series is better or whether a basic income guarantee is morally required. Advocacy in writing requires you to make an argument, but there's a difference between having an argument and making an argument. Having an argument just means you're disagreeing with someone loudly. Making an argument involves providing reasons, and not just any kind of reasons that are acceptable to the person that you're making the argument to. So what's the point of an argumentative paper? What sorts of things do you want to accomplish in it? Typically, you're going to try to clarify the relationship between different concepts, say between freedom and democracy, or justice and legitimacy. You're also going to want to try to persuade the reader that your view of the relationship between these concepts is the correct view. And perhaps at the end of the day, you are looking to discover the truth about the matter. Now, there's no guarantee that there's always a truth of the matter. Is red better than blue? I don't know if there's a truth about that sort of question. Is up better than down? Again, I'm not sure that there's a truth to that sort of question. However, there might be areas where there is a truth of the matter, and to the extent that before we start, we can't assume that there's no truth of the matter, you want to at least leave open the possibility that there is some real answer to the question that you're asking. In order to accomplish these goals, you have to respect your reader. This means you need to be aware of who you're talking to, who your audience is. Most of the time you're writing an essay for a class, and so you're writing for a professor, but you need to imagine that there's a wider audience here that you're trying to talk to. This audience is not your friend. They don't have to believe you just because you say so. This means that you have to provide evidence to them as rational, possibly slightly skeptical adults. You want to respect their intelligence, but also their time. Time is one thing we really can't make a whole lot more of, and good essays don't waste people's time by repeating things that are unnecessary, or again, doing unnecessary work. Maybe it's productive work, it just might not be productive for this essay. So be efficient, but don't be lazy. Proofread your paper, edit your paper, proofread your paper, edit your paper. Ultimately, efficient papers are written by careful and often vigorous editing. So let's imagine that you've received an essay prompt, or you've thought up a good topic on your own. What do? I suggest 3 steps to start your inquiry. Interpret, analyze, and argue. Let's look at a sample paper topic that I sometimes give to my Intro to Political Theory class. Socrates' commitment to political authority and the ideal of a just man led to his death by public execution. Was Socrates a fool to think that he must accept that fate? So the first thing you want to do is interpret the question. What does the question really mean? What is the person asking the question really trying to get at with this question? In this example, I think the question is superficially, or only superficially, about the story of Socrates. The story of Socrates is intended as a way of getting at a deeper question about how far we ought to respect political authority. So any answer to this question about Socrates should also contain the seeds of a general answer to the question of whether obedience to authority up to the death is foolish or not, and one that's not just applicable to Socrates in particular, but citizens in general. You also want to analyze the question. So after you've interpreted what the question is supposed to mean or what it's be about, look at some of the key terms or concepts involved in the question or implied by the question and how they relate. So in this case, what's the relationship between the just man, whatever that is, and being obedient to political authority, whatever that is? You're going to have to come up with some sort of working definition of what it means to be a just man and some sort of definition to what it means to have political authority in order to be able to answer the question fully. Also, you might want to ask yourself, what does it mean to be foolish? One of the typical ways that students run into trouble with this question is that they fail to distinguish between somebody who's foolish and someone who's merely mistaken. It's quite possible to be mistaken in a non-foolish way, and it's probably possible to be right and still be a fool if you're just right by accident. And once you've analyzed all of these terms and come up with working definitions, you want to argue your point. You need to formulate a thesis. Your thesis is going to look something like the following. Being committed to political authority to the point of giving your life is or is not foolish because, and then of course you're going to have to give a set of reasons as to why it is or it isn't foolish. Okay, so let's get away from Socrates for a minute. There's going to be different kinds of arguments that you might, or different kinds of points that you'll be liable to make in an essay. In particular, you want to be very clear when you're talking about questions of facts and when you're talking about questions of values. Questions of fact, and both kinds of questions are going to be debatable. People disagree about what the facts are all the time, and they disagree about what values are applicable all the time. But what counts as evidence in a factual disagreement and what counts as evidence in a disagreement about values are going to be very different sorts of things. So if you want to make an empirical argument about the facts, you need to go look at the literature. You want to talk about whether democracy increases human well-being, well, there's a literature on that, right? There's a literature on the relationship between democracy and happiness. So if you're going to make claims about it, you probably better go look at what data people have found on the subject. On the other hand, if you're making an argument about values, for example, perhaps you think that democracy is the way to respectfully treat people who are politically equals, then you're going to have to appeal to shared principles. Principles about what it means to be politically equal and why that requires something like democracy. Now, in addition to being aware of your reader, you should be aware of your opponent. Who's disagreeing with you? Who are you arguing against? You need to know something about this in order to orient your argument in the right sort of way. If nobody could possibly disagree with your argument, that's not an evidence that your argument is strong. It's evidence that your argument is probably trivial. People only really agree at the end of the day about fairly trivial things. If your argument is really obvious, then you've probably missed something about the prompt. I generally don't ask questions that are trivial. So you want to reinterpret and reanalyze the question in order to make sure that you're understanding what the question is really about. What are your opponents likely to say? What are they thinking? What would they say in response to your points? Again, having a strong awareness of who your opponents are and what they're likely to say is the key often to making a good argument. You want to anticipate challenges to all of your points. That's important. You want to react in advance. So you want to say things like, well, some people in response to my point would say this, but here's why that response fails. Right? That would be a good way of anticipating challenges. And you want to state these challenges as clearly as possible. You don't want to defeat weak challenges. You want to defeat strong challengers. Right? There's no glory in defeating obviously mistaken views. So you want to deal with these, and you want to deal with all of these challenges, difficult challenges, by appealing to evidence, by appealing to non-controversial definitions, and by appealing to principles that your readers are likely to share. In fact, if you can show that your opponents are relying on controversial evidence or definitions, or they're relying on principles that are not that widely shared, that doesn't mean that they're wrong, but you might succeed in persuading your audience that their argument isn't very good. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about what we're doing in an argumentative paper, let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of how the paper is supposed to be written. You want to get started with an introduction, you want to finish with a conclusion, and in between you're probably going to have a series of related paragraphs that are going to make your argument. Now, you don't need to make the argument in the introduction, and you certainly don't want to make it in the conclusion. Introductions are supposed to introduce. What that means is that you're going to introduce a thesis. You're going to establish ultimately a contract with your reader. That's the most important thing that your introduction can do. Establish a contract with your reader. Lay out what you're going to argue in the essay, and in particular, lay out how you're going to argue it. So, a thesis and some supporting reasons. You don't want to lay out the whole argument. You just want to have an outline of what your argument is. And the rest of your essay is going to be following through on the commitment that you're making in the introduction. Try not to write your paper as a series of mysteries, like a mystery story. Right? We don't want to find out what your point was at the end. We want to know what you're doing throughout the essay. That's what it means to write clearly. Once your introduction has successfully been completed, you're going to have a series of paragraphs that need to be well organized. You need to help yourself out here and help your reader out. You can do this by keeping each paragraph related to one idea rather than more than one idea, and making sure that you have good transitions between the paragraphs so that your reader doesn't get lost. Let's talk about this idea of one idea per paragraph. You want to focus on one thing at a time. Students often like to move very quickly through their argument without considering it at length. You want to make sure that you're really done with an idea before you move on. So you want to consider, is your point correct? Is the evidence solid? Is it weak? What could be said for and against it? The point is that you want to consider an idea fully before you move on. What about transitions? Well, you don't want to lose your reader, which means you need to use transition words to help the reader follow your train of thoughts rather than jumping from idea to idea in ways that your reader might find hard to follow. So, for example, good transition words include things like however, therefore, thus, as a result, on the one hand, on the other hand. All these little phrases are ways of telling your reader that telling your reader what the relationship is between one paragraph and the next. So here's an example. You could say, because North Korean citizens cannot have a voice in their political affairs, they cannot take any sort of control over them. As such, there's an erosion of freedom. However, there's a problem with only having a voice. Right? So this transition says basically that North Koreans don't have free speech. Because they don't have free speech, it makes it very hard for them to take any sort of political control over their lives or over their political affairs. And as such, they're unfree. But there's a problem with only having a voice. That is to say, having a voice is not the only thing that contributes to an erosion of freedom. Right? And this tells the author where you're going next. It's not the only place you could have gone from that first sentence, but it's certainly one place, and explaining, therefore, where you went is helpful. I think the number one virtue of any given paper is clarity. So above all things, try to be clear. In this Calvin and Hobbes vignette, Calvin's trying to use really complicated words to ultimately convince people that he's smart. But in reality, using really complicated words that you might yourself not understand that well isn't being smart, and it isn't convince people that you're smart, and it's not going to be very, very clear to anyone. So again, consider making your vocabulary accessible. That is to say, your reader needs to be able to understand you, and you need to be able to use words that you fully understand. Okay, so once you have a clear introduction, a clear series of paragraphs that are clearly related to one another, you get to your conclusion. A lot of students like to try to continue their argument in the conclusion. The argument becomes a kind of gotcha at the end, where you finally figure out what the student is trying to say. That's not the purpose of a conclusion. The purpose of the conclusion is to restate the arguments that you've already said. Restate your major arguments and the major pieces of evidence that you've brought to bear in favor of your argument. Another thing you might want to do in your conclusion is think about what the implications are for your argument. What are the areas that are still unresolved or unclear? If you can show an awareness of how your argument fits into a broader literature, or fits into broader themes, or how it might be applicable elsewhere than where you've applied it in your essay, you are showing the reader that the significance of what you've done. All right, that concludes this video on advocacy and writing.